The rhythm of healing, the Octavesmethod. O is for observation, through stillness we find meditation and breathwork that quiet the mind. In silence we listen, the answers are clear, awareness emerges, dissolving the fear. C is for compassion, for self and for all, embracing the good, the struggles, the fall. With kindness we grow, we nurture, we mend, learning to love ourselves as we extend. T is for therapy, a path we explore. Daily we practice unlocking the door. From journaling to mindfulness, healing begins. Each step is a victory as peace settles in. A is for animals and laughter so bright, like children at a play, their joy taking flight. With playfulness and movement, we rediscover the way to heal through the fun that we often delay. V is for victuals, nourishing and pure, detoxifying the body and keeping us sure. We choose what we eat with intention and grace, fueling our journey at our own pace. E is for exercise, where movement is free. We stretch and we bend in sweet harmony. Flexibility grows with choices we make. In strength and in stillness, our bodies awake. S is for socialize, where self-growth begins. Others reflect our triggers and the places within. Through relationships, our true selves we find, growing and healing with each tie that binds. The Octavesmethod, where all behavior makes sense. We just need to find the sense it presents. We just need to find the sense it presents. We just need to find the sense it presents.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Season 5 of the Trauma and Social Work Podcast. I am KJ Alexander here with my co-host, Tonya Octave, and today we have a lot of important information to dive into. But before we get started, I'm going to go ahead and let Tonya tell a little bit more about herself and what this podcast is about.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tonya Octave, and we are going into Season 5 of Trauma and Social Work Podcasts, where we will be discussing and diving deep into my book called Healthymind, 7 Strategies Towards Mental Wellness, Happiness, and Success, Exploring Trauma, Mental Wellness, and Ways to Live a More Balanced Life. And before we begin, just a simple reminder that this podcast is for informational purposes only. It is not intended for medical, psychological, mental health, or legal advice. Although I'm a licensed professional, this is not a formal type of treatment. We may talk about things like hypnosis and meditation and things that we would do in a therapeutic, from a therapeutic perspective, but it's not a form of treatment. For individual questions about your wellness, your happiness, and your success, please seek out a professional. And if you are experiencing a mental health crisis, do call 911 or go to your nearest emergency room.
Great, awesome. That was amazing. So with that being said, I want to make sure I tell the audience, if you haven't already, follow this page on Spotify, YouTube, and any other platforms we post episodes on. Make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any upcoming episodes in the future. And with that being said, let's go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast. This is the Trauma and Social Work Podcast. My name is KJ Alexander, and I'm joined once again with Tonya Octave. And today we're going to be continuing our discussion into the book, Heal Thy Mind. And in today's episode, we wanted to cover the topic of compassion and ego health. So Before we begin, if you guys haven't already, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. So as we continue our discussion and we move on towards the topic of compassion and ego health, I was wondering if you can kind of share with the audience the section of this book that stood out most to you.
Okay. I think a part that I really appreciate is compassion and self compassion, being kind to yourself, acknowledging your feelings, even the difficult ones, without any judgment. Often that mind wants to come in, that negative part of the mind wants to come in and give these negative self-talks and negativity and ways of thinking. But really practicing self compassion helps to build and replenish your emotions. And I think it makes it easier to extend compassion for others. So, for example, like when I make a mistake, to replace this self critical thought more from a place and come from more of a place of understanding. So I say, maybe I'm doing the best that I can do and try. And although sometimes I may stumble, I'm going to get back up and this is how it's going to look. And another part that kind of stands out when I was reflecting on the second chapter, compassion and ego health, was really listening without judgment. When engaging with others, being able to listen actively, attentively, without ready to reply or respond, and not trying to have these kind of preconceived judgments, trying to understand the feelings and perspectives, even if you don't agree with them. And I think this is kind of an attestment what I talked about in the first chapter, or in the second chapter, compassion and ego health. So it starts off with the proverb: every human being is the author of his or her own health or disease. And that's a Buddhist proverb from Ayurvedic healing. And the affirmation that I like for this section is: I am likable, I am lovable, I am enough. I am likable, I am lovable, I am enough. I am likable, I am lovable, I am enough. And so I like to say that 3 times. And so as I continued, I shared a little bit of my own personal story. And this is what it reads: when I was a little girl, I adored my daddy, and he loved me. He spoiled me, treating me like a princess. My parents were not living together, but I would visit him. I was daddy's little girl, and he would give me anything I wanted. I felt loved and wanted. Over the years, he sometimes would help me financially, but this was not consistent. My mom encouraged our relationship. Being a single parent was financially a challenge for her. When I was in 6th grade, my mom requested child support, and eventually the case went to court. After the court case, my dad dropped out of my life. Suddenly, there was no contact at all. Our relationship changed. I went from daddy's little girl, spoiled and adored, to not seeing him. I felt abandoned and unloved. I felt a lot of anger. And as I moved into my teenage years and adulthood, those feelings of abandonment translated into other relationships, especially with men. I struggled going into a deep depression. And in my 20s, while I was at the University of California, Irvine, I tried to reconnect with him and rebuild the relationship. It took more than 20 years for us to reconcile and for me to work through my stuff. I needed to forgive and to let go while dealing with feelings of being unlovable and abandoned. Through my own experience, I have learned to have compassion to find healing in my life. And I like to say, like, that part of the story is about showing up in this open and receptive way. And even when I read it now, I can still feel the emotion attached to it. And I know that people in our audience have this same type of connection, maybe with one parent, maybe with 2 parents, maybe a caregiver, or somebody else who showed up as an adult figure, and then maybe the relationship changed, maybe the expectations changed. And so for me, I had to display compassion. I didn't know my dad's story, and I only knew part of my mom's story. And it took a lot of strength, it took a lot of courage to sit with my dad and hear things from his perspective. And in that journey, it was a beautiful place. to travel with him and reconnect with him before his passing. But that's where I say compassion comes from. It doesn't always have to be these grand gestures, but maybe there's small acts of kindness, maybe a smile, maybe a thoughtful message, maybe opening or closing the door for someone, or taking a step to the side so that they can go in first. That can make someone feel really important in their life, because there were these little people who helped support me and reconnecting me on my journey back to my dad, and developing that relationship. What ended up being a beautiful relationship along the whole path in and of itself. And so I'd like to remind people, when you're faced with challenges that you may not see, how can you approach this with patience, understanding, and then I add in that compassion and forgiveness.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a very important message, and I want to thank you once again for sharing such a important and sensitive story. And I'm sure that our audience can appreciate it and definitely relate to a lot of aspects of it. And I think it is important to, as far as showing compassion to those who you may have felt a different way about at some point in time. And I think it's beneficial for everybody involved. So I wanted to read this last section here. So it says, compassion is the ability to be loving and accepting of yourself, all the good and the bad, to respect other people's perspectives while practicing self-care, forgiving people for wrongs committed against you, and making efforts to show kindness. To have compassion, you must first deal with your ego. And I thought that was a very strong way to end that section right there. So you talk about first dealing with the ego in order to have compassion. And I can definitely tell that, the ego is a very strong theme, especially in this chapter. So why is the ego, what does the ego have to do with compassion, and how does it, I'm sure you mentioned this in a later chapter of the book, but I just wonder if you can kind of talk about how does ego relate to compassion? Do they go hand in hand, and how do they kind of relate to each other?
Thank you for making that connection, because there is a connection, and I'll use it with the story that I shared. When I was born, I was daddy's little girl. I got everything I want. I was the princess. I was the starlight of his eyes. There was something that transpired between my mom and my dad, and all I knew as a child in sixth grade that relationship changed. And my dad wasn't present in my life, nor was I present in his life in the same way. And so in that journey, I got angry. I was frustrated. I was irritated. It was displaced in all kinds of things. But what I didn't understand is that the ego was out of balance. I was out of homeostasis. Something happened, like a trauma. I felt abandoned. I felt unloved, which is the core of how we show up in the world. There was conflicts about trust. So when we think about child development, and the first things that are developed is, does a child feel lovable? Because if they don't feel lovable enough, they die. They simply die. This is based on research. Is there trust
Mhm.
that's being, do I feel like I can trust the adults? Do I feel like adults even are trustworthy in the world? And so that was the foundation. My ego was saying, okay, this is homeostasis. This is where we want to keep you. And then a hiccup happens, like trauma, like for many of the people in our audience. Something happens in childhood that disrupts that and gets us out of equilibrium, gets us disconnected from truer parts of ourself in childhood. And when that happens, the ego does things like send defense mechanism in. And for me, and then you add hormones and other developmental kind of stages as I grow a little bit older, anger is manifested in this very aggressive way, in this very irritable way. And as it's manifested, I don't understand it. It's just expressed in the world, and the world doesn't like it because the world gives me back things. My mom tells me things about how I'm showing up, family tells me things, schools and teachers tell us things about how we're showing up, and we don't understand it. But what was happening was these defense mechanisms was protecting me, because that's what the ego is supposed to do. When the ego feels threatened because of that incident that happened, that trauma that happens in our lives, a defense mechanism comes out to try to keep us back in homeostasis, to keep us back in balance. And that really is when I learned to understand that, then I had compassion for myself. I gave myself, what do we call it? A get out of jail free card. I gave myself a get out of jail free card for my ego for the rest of my life, because I no longer have to judge things or judge myself in that process. That I can know that there is something that is trying to teach me something, and I'm learning the lesson. I'm not resisting the lesson. And I think that's a part where compassion comes from. Because one of the things that I think about in terms of forgiveness is that, particularly for young people, because this occurred in my 20s, when we're in relationships, and that can be an intimate relationship, that can be a relationship with a parent or a sibling, and something happens to disrupt that, something happens to get us out of that balanced state. What makes it difficult for young people to forgive at that stage? What makes it difficult for young people to come back and have that compassion for themselves and also for the other person when that perception of that experience blows up, as I might say? What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, so it sounds like what I gather from that is that the ego kind of, the ego in a sense is not a friend to compassion, in the sense of our ego tells us to do things that can be contrary to being compassionate, just due to the fact that it's trying to preserve some type of self-image or self-identity that we built up over the years. So, excuse me. So it really brings me to think that, we as humans in society today have sort of evolved past the need for a basic ego function, whereas the ego now can only serve you if a person learns how to master and control it, like we've said previously. And compassion is very contrary to what we consider like a baseline ego, because most people who don't spend any time getting to like know themselves and know their parents and know where they come from, they probably don't have as much compassion as somebody who does those things. So, and I wondered, does that have to do with, is the ego itself the one who makes it harder for people to have compassion, or does it rest solely on the person, if that makes sense?
Let me see if I can think of a metaphor that might go along with how we can understand the ego. This actually happens. Let's say at 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 ages, your mom and dad gave you Coca-Cola as a drink. Now, when you first drink the Coca-Cola when you're 3 years old, the gut is like, ooh, the body's like, ah. All things start to happen internally to process and break down the acidity from the soda. But by the time you're 6 and you're 7, you don't feel those initial sensations, but that doesn't mean that the body isn't breaking it down. That means that your sensitivity to it has diminished. So the bad stuff is still going on, but you don't feel it as when you first started drinking that soda when you were 3 years old. The body has become the homeostasis part. That is your balance. That doesn't mean that it's healthy, because the ego doesn't judge it. The body doesn't judge it. The body does what it needs to try to counteract this chemical reaction in the body to keep it balanced. So now it knows when you drink soda what it needs to do to try to keep a balance going. That becomes the ego. Now, is giving soda to a 3-year-old healthy? I'm going to say no. I don't care what anybody says. I'm going to say absolutely no.
Probably not. Yeah.
So the mind comes in and makes a judgment about it and says, no, this is not okay. So when the body is functioning, it's functioning to keep that balance. So we sometimes function to keep things in balance, even though they're not healthy for us. So I may know what it's like to be unloved. That's my balance. That's my homeostasis. And when a healthy male or female relationship comes in my life, and then I say, oh, this person loves me, but I don't show up in a loving way because my balance is an unhealthy relationship. So I may do things like people say self sabotage in that relationship. I may do things like acting out. These are all parts of the defense mechanisms to come out to try to get you back to that balanced state, which could be acidic soda in the body. Does that
Mm.
metaphor kind of help in understanding in terms of the body does what it needs to do to be the balance, but the balance may not be healthy. So that's where the psychotherapy comes in to start to rewiring some of the stuff that was unconscious. That's the psychotherapy. Some of the stuff that is most of the stuff that is subconscious, that's kind of like the work of hypnosis. And then the conscious part, which is usually the lesser part of all of our memories, but the memory that we hold the most emotions to. So when you
Yeah.
think about forgiveness, or when you think about the connection of compassion and forgiveness, what do you see as the compassion, knowing that bringing us into that state could still be an acidic state?
Yeah. So I think that as we go through life and over time, we start to build up. We start to build up our egos, and they start to form stronger identities. And it may become harder to have compassion if that's not something that you implement at an early stage in life. So I think it's important. We need to teach people these concepts at a very young age. That way, it'll be easier for them as they grow older, and it won't be as hard to kind of have more control over one's ego as they get older. But I feel like most people, a lot of people in today's society probably aren't even aware of what the ego really is. They may think they know, but they may not really have a true understanding. So I think that alone probably is like the biggest issue with this topic. And as far as compassion, I mean, it's not really the most compassionate era in human history. Um, although it has been, very good in some areas, I still feel like this era we live in is very much ego driven, not so much driven by compassion,
So
and
let
that
me
may have a lot to do with it.
let me slow you down because you said a couple of things that are important. The idea that we have to teach people about the ego and that the world is ego driven. An idea is, do we teach kids? Do we teach parents? Do we teach adults? And then my thought said, we have to do more unteaching than teaching because nowadays, and I'll give you an example, going to your pediatrician and your pediatrician telling you that you can give cow's dairy milk to your infant is okay. But research, a huge body of research, even in not just Eastern medicine, but in Western medicine, tells us how inflammatory dairy can be, especially to a young body. So there's a lot more unteaching to do than trying to teach people the truth. We got
Yeah,
a lot of myths, a lot of misperceptions out there about what people believe to be true. And you don't have to take it from me. Look at an infant who is given dairy and look at the medical paperwork of how many immune related illnesses they will have and how many antibiotics they will prescribe to fit that versus infants who are not giving cow's milk. They have very low incidence. So I like encourage people to do their own research, because a lot of this is the unlearning of the stuff that we've been told. And how do we show up knowing that the ego is there? So I think about it. I'll give you a little thing. Think about a time think of a memory you have from 10 to 18 where you engaged in an activity that you felt was good for you. So don't tell us what that activity is. Just think of an activity from about 10 to 18 where you engaged in that activity and you thought it was healthy. And then 5 years later, did you discover something different about that activity, about the consequences of that activity? Okay, so I think we can all reflect on that. So some of it is an unlearning of the process. Some of it is we have to go through things in order to figure out stuff for ourselves, and that's part of the journey. But as part of the human condition, we can all relate to being younger, engaging in an act, like smiling and posting about it and sharing things with the world that this is a beautiful thing. Fast forward 5 years in the future, we soon find out that this could be something that's not healthy for us to engage in. So I think we can all relate to that. How does the ego play? It shows up. It's going to defend once you try to stop that behavior. It's going to show up and it's going to convince you, oh, what you mean? You just need to do it one more time. Oh, this is silly research. You don't need to listen to that person. Oh, these are just, it's going to convince you, even though the truest part of you knows, and I'll give my example, that soda is toxic. But you're going to want to resist because the ego is going to send these defense mechanisms out there, like intellectualization. Well, what do you mean you can't give soda to a 5-year-old? My pediatrician said that it was okay. I hope there's no pediatricians out there, but I wouldn't be surprised if a pediatrician says one soda won't kill. I'm sorry, pour sodas into plants one time. It will destroy the plant. So I think we have to think about things that we're doing and know that we are also caught up in a lot of untruths. And the idea is to find the truth for ourselves, a truth that we can settle in that really is probably based, more, I would say, more on a spiritual truth, because there's just so many kind of things that we have to unlearn in the world. But when we're 20, when we think about our development in our 20s, we are at a stage where we are coming into our independence. We are coming into being an adult. So we're learning about bills. We're learning about life. Boy, are we learning about relationships. We're learning how to cook. We're learning about that relationship with food. We're learning about emotions. Intensity of emotions arises at this developmental stage. And so know that the ego is present. Acknowledge it. Name it if you need to. Mine may come out like Lisa. Lisa sometimes is my ego. And I say, oh, Lisa, you're showing up again. Okay. I see you're pretty strong. You're trying to send these defense mechanisms out. And then I ask myself, why? But know in your 20s that that is a place not for you to judge yourself, but for you to figure out things for yourself. So then there comes this idea of judgment. When you believe someone has hurt you in a relationship, she broke your heart, he left you for someone else, and you feel that type of despair, that type of sadness, that type of loneliness, abandonment, those feelings, how do you still offer forgiveness?
Absolutely. I think that's a major point that you just made. And like you said before, a lot of people have to, they carry around this ego with them all their lives, and it tells them things, and it tells them how to react to situations and how to treat people. And it's almost like, it's like living in the past in a sense, to where like everything you do currently is based on something that happened to you previously. And I think that that could be a very problematic but it could also be helpful in some cases too. But
Okay.
I believe the ego probably was more useful to us when we were more in a basic living environment, maybe in the early humanity days. But now, as we have kind of evolved and gotten past certain things, we need to develop more control over our minds and our lives and stop being so focused on the past, right? Because I think that's where people have a problem being forgiving and showing compassion, is because they hold so much weight on the past and events that happened previously.
Can you give an
But
example of what you mean when you say they hold kind of like people hold things on from the past?
yeah, well, as human beings, we are very unique in the sense that we are historians, and we like to what's the word? We like to take note and memorialize things that happened in our lives, whether it be birthdays or holidays or whatever the case may be. So and that's good when it's good, but when it comes to things that may be a little problematic, um, it's not really useful. So I'll give an example. Like, you know, I mean, how many wars have been started based on something that happened years previously and may or may not have anything to do with what was currently going on in the time. And even on even in a society level, there's people who, like, there's certain crimes that have been considered legal now that people are still in jail for because they committed in the past. Which, I mean, I understand that's the law, but if you think about it logically, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. But even on a smaller personal level, like, there's people who still hold grudges against their ex girlfriend or ex boyfriend, or even a parent for something that happened 10, 20 plus years ago. And it's kind of like, at a certain point, you can't change the past. So for you to hold it against somebody is kind of silly, especially if you see them trying to correct and make amends for the issue, in my opinion.
And, and you kind of really hit it. It's you started off global where we could hold on to these things historically. And then you started to narrow it in, like even in today, we're holding on to something that happened in middle school from a relationship and bringing it into a current relationship and having that grudge. And when we hold it on, where do we think we're holding it on? We're holding it inside. And when we hold it inside, what feeling is associated? Grudge, anger, frustration, irritability, resentment, jealousy. And what do we think those emotions, do we think those emotions are alkaline or acidic? They're acidic. So we're holding on to acidic emotions that is allowing acidity to develop in the body, that's changing cells, the way the cells function, and they're moving from alkaline cells to acidic cells. So it's more than just giving the 3-year-old soda. It's damaging the internal parts of our body when we can't forgive, when we hold on to these things. And I think that's why people struggle a lot in their 20s because of this holding on to and not being able to forgive or demonstrate compassion. Like, yep, Lisa, ego, you showed up. Okay, you're there. I don't need you anymore. I don't need to
Yeah.
intellectualize this situation. I don't need protection. I got it. Thank you. I'm just going to sit in the sadness. I'll sit in the loneliness. It's okay. It's an emotion. I get to feel it.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. And one thing I kind of realized too while you were talking is that we live in a generation where everything we do and say is basically, there's a record of it being kept on the internet for the most part.
Mhm.
So whereas in times past, if you had an argument with somebody or a fallout or something like that, and if nobody was around to record it or take a picture of it, then people kind of just forgot about it, or
Mm.
it could be kind of just dismissed. But these days, I mean, there's so much stuff on the internet, people putting, family business on the internet,
Mm.
getting children involved, personal messages being posted. It's like And then it's one thing if the person you're in a relationship forgives you, but there's no guarantee that the family or the friends of the person will forgive you. So then you have to deal with that moving forward, and it just creates a lot more issues that we may not have had to deal with in times past. So I think that's kind of interesting to note.
One of the things that helped me when I was working through forgiveness, not just with my dad, but in other relationships, more so like learning to forgive myself, was a quote. I actually have the quote in the book
Okay.
um, from Mother Teresa. And it actually was given to me by I was seeing a therapist at the time, and she related it to me. And it says, people are often unreasonable, irrational, and self centered. Forgive them anyway. If you are kind, people may accuse you of selfish, ulterior motives. Be kind anyway. If you are successful, you will win some unfaithful friends and some genuine enemies. Succeed anyway. If you are honest and sincere, people may deceive you. Be honest and sincere anyways. What you spend years creating, others could destroy overnight. Create anyways. If you find serenity and happiness, some may be jealous. Be happy anyways. The good you do today will often be forgotten. Do good anyway. Give the best you have, and it will never be enough. Give your best anyway. In the final analysis, it is between you and God. It is never between you and them. And I think
Mhm.
if we move towards that perspective, that's when we say, Lisa, ego, I don't need you anymore. I got this.
Mm, absolutely. And I think that's a great place for us to leave off on today's episode. Is there anything you wanted to leave the audience with, maybe where they could find you before we close out?
Mhm. You can always find me on social media at Holistic Clinician, and then you can go to my website at TanyaOctave-LCSW.com. And I would like to leave with a quote from the Dalai Lama. If you want others to be happy, practice compassion. If you want to be happy, practice compassion. Life can be simple.
Absolutely. Very, very important message. I want to thank our audience for tuning into today's episode. Don't forget, if you haven't already, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We will have more episodes coming out in the next couple of days. So with that being said, we're going to wrap up today's episode. Thanks again for joining us. Until next time, bye-bye.
Wraps up another episode. I hope today's discussion provided clarity and tools you can use in your daily life. If you're ready to take the next step in the healing journey, I'd love to connect. Head over to my website to schedule a free 15-minute consultation. It is a great opportunity to ask questions and see how we can work together. And while you're there, download my complimentary workbook designed to help you reflect, grow, and move towards mental wellness, happiness, and success. Thanks for listening, and I will see you next time. The Rhythm of Healing, the Octavesmethod. O is for observation, through stillness we find meditation and breath work that quiet the mind. In silence we listen, the answers are clear, awareness emerges, dissolving the fear. C is for compassion, for self and for all, embracing the good, the struggles, the fall. With kindness we grow, we nurture, we mend, learning to love ourselves as we extend. T is for therapy, a path we explore. Daily we practice unlocking the door. From journaling to mindfulness, healing begins. Each step is a victory as peace settles in. A is for animals and laughter so bright, like children at a play, their joy taking flight. With playfulness and movement, we rediscover the way to heal through the fun that we often delay. V is for victuals, nourishing and pure, detoxifying the body and keeping us sure. We choose what we eat with intention and grace, fueling our journey at our own pace. E is for exercise where movement is free. We stretch and we bend in sweet harmony. Flexibility grows with choices we make in strength and in stillness. Our bodies awake. S is for socialize where self-growth begins. Others reflect our triggers and the places within. Through relationships, our true selves we find, growing and healing with each tie that binds. The Octavesmethod, where all behavior makes sense. We just need to find the sense it presents. We just need to find the sense it presents. We just need to find the sense it presents.